right, it looks like we're live. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me for today's stream. I've been looking forward to this discussion that we're going to have today. Let me double check audio and everything like that. But if you've been following my Twitter or Telegram today, you'll know that our guest today is the Prudentialist at Mr. Prudentialist on Twitter. Maybe I would guess that most people watching this are probably familiar with the Prudentialist and his work. But I'd highly recommend, of course, that everyone go check out his work. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing good. How are you, man?
I'm great. Well, thank you very much for coming on. I'm looking forward to today's discussion. And so what I would like to talk about today, what I'd like to discuss is something that anybody who's familiar with your work has probably heard you talk about, at least touch on, something that is fairly important to anybody who has spoken in a dissident right or nationalist or any kind of non-mainstream context, and that is the state of identity in the United States and in the West more broadly, the deracination that's taken place, the uprooting of that identity and the culture. And so my goal today is to get, as I told you off screen, and I'll tell the audience briefly the format, and we will probably deviate from this, but the format for today is just talking about deracination, what it is, and the role that the internet has played in that process specifically, and what we should expect to experience from that going forward, as well as how to deal with it and how to reassert and retain an American identity, a local and regional identity, and then personally how we should view ourselves in the world going forward. Before we get started, would you like to tell anybody who watches this like where they can find you? Is there anywhere specific you'd like them to look?
Oh, sure. So you can find me on YouTube, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, Gab, and Twitter, as you mentioned at the beginning of the introduction. I will plug a fantastic website called findmyfriends.net, FRENS, like everyone posting their appoos in the morning when they say good morning. Findmyfriends.net, you'll find myself there and almost all of your favorite sort of dissident or non-mainstream right-wing personalities on that website. It's basically our replacement to Linktree, because a lot of our guys have been deplatformed there. So you can find me there at findmyfriends/the Prudentialist and all the other platforms I previously mentioned.
Very good. Very good. So you have a bit of a foreign policy background, and I find that stuff interesting, and it's very good information. What really has kind of caught my eye, piqued my interest with your channel and the content you create is more about the social and the cultural content that you create. I like the observations that you make in Real Talk and some of the other videos that you make where you're talking about your everyday experience and how it relates to these bigger issues that we're talking about. Specifically, I watched your video on reality versus artificiality, and this is something that I've been thinking about in a while. The reason that I included, we're not going to get into like the Tower of Babel or the internet as any form of modern Tower of Babel, like specifically into the symbology or anything of that, but I've thought for a long time about the way that so when mankind and the story of the Tower of Babel was all working together to create this huge monument essentially to their own accomplishments, motivated by their own pride or hubris, God used language to divide them. Now, language is just one. Of course, it was geography and other stuff used to divide them, but language naturally acts as a barrier between people. It prevents people from coming together too closely and mixing too closely, and it prevents cooperation. And with the internet and the other media that we have today, these barriers are removed. And now this is one of the most extreme examples. Of course, more simply, you are on TikTok or you're on Twitter or whatever social media, or you're watching the same shows, you're seeing the same trends, you're following the same people. And so people begin to speak the same way, they begin to act the same, they begin to think the same way about things. And so in a moment, I want to get an explanation from you about deracination, what you think it is, how you think it's affected us specifically. And then we'll get more into how the internet specifically has done that. So in your words, what is the significance of deracination? What should that mean to us?
So the way I've really been looking at it is that deracination comes in so many ways. The one I've been really focused specifically on, it's sort of been my cultural, point of interest and focal point to take a action on or at least talk about has been digital deracination. The internet has been the greatest medium for all things of cultural export. I mean, in the past, America had Hollywood TV shows and movies where if you were to hop on an international flight, you were to say that you're from Texas, right? You would get someone asking, did you watch the TV show Dallas? Like, are you from that city, right? Like that TV show, it kind of provided this geographic understanding for the rest of the world for Texas. And now with the internet and TikTok or Twitter or YouTube, it's just blown up in the ability for people all over the world to sort of have an understanding of what is sort of like the cultural consensus, so to speak, to where a good friend of mine, he's on YouTube by the name of Conscious Caracol. He works for AfriForum in South Africa. The story that always sticks with me is that he was in downtown Pretoria in South Africa, and then he was listening to this like teenager speak English with a perfect American accent. So this young
Mm.
man is just totally uprooted from his culture, from his language, and he's talking and behaving the same way that you would see the internet stars of today do. And so that's been something that I'm really concerned about because for the last 2 years, especially between, a certain Chinese delicacy and the lockdowns that preceded it, it kind of worries me that people have doubled, tripled, quadrupled the amount of screen time that are on their phones. And for people that want to preserve or take action against, entropy, disorder, chaos, things that are the opposite of law, beauty, and so on, it gets really hard to break yourself away and separate from that nasty digital Skinner box that's literally in your pocket almost 24/7, except for when you're sleeping, and that's usually right next to your nightstand. So, to me, it's really concerning that, especially as younger generations are getting more active in politics, and they're learning about the same things or the same mistakes that have been made in the past, that it gets really easy to get caught up online in group chats or what the latest trend is, chasing hot takes and banger tweet threads or whatever, and not focusing on the things that matter, like your personal health or your relationship to your community. And as Jordan Peterson as that all sounds, like I think that it kind of speaks volumes when there are more and more studies about how digital learning hasn't done any good for people, and people have used their televisions or their smartphones as ways to abdicate parental responsibility. So I think that it really does behoove anyone who's interested in right wing thought to find a way to separate themselves from the digital in a healthy way. Doesn't mean you don't have to cut it off completely. I'm not saying take up monastic orders or something like that. I'm simply saying we should probably find a healthier way to not only use the digital, but also find a way to use it as a force multiplier for our activities in the real world.
Hmm. And so what when you say separate from it, like what alternatives are there? Obviously people can think of, okay, well, I get off my phone and I go I go fishing, or I go to a coffee shop, or I do do find hobbies, woodworking, guitar, whatever the case may be. What is what is the danger? You touched on it there. What is like the danger of being stuck exclusively online, aside from just like it's bad for your brain and that sort of thing? But what is like the cultural danger of living exclusively online and having no like connection to the community that you live in?
Well, that's the dangerous part of the deracination is that if you're perpetually online, if you're it's almost like how we would make fun of like, conservatives yelling at their like Fox News, or their favorite radio jockey from like the 90s and 2000s. It's just if we're spending all of our time, yelling at what's going on our phones or what the latest news feed or doom scrolling or looking at fear porn is going to be, I do think that that does keep you in sort of this perpetual attitude of defeatism or just snarky remarks. And you may not even notice that, hey, there's this big thing going down at city council that you might want to be aware of. I know it depends because I know in the cities it's not nearly as high trust as, say, smaller towns or suburbia, but it's just, the question is like, do you know your neighbor is something that a lot of people I don't think these days know or care to know. I think that it bothers me, at least politically, that there are people that will want to rant and rave about, big national elections and campaigns, when too oftentimes a lot of the things that affect their day-to-day life are things that are usually maybe a 20-minute drive away. And I think it gets really daunting for a lot of young people, especially, that we want to think that politics is this big, overarching, sweeping narrative about the course of history, and that's partially true. But at the same time, you also need to have the will and the self-discipline to get your butt up at like 6 o'clock in the morning, drive to downtown, sign the paperwork so you can give public comment at your city council meeting that's going to determine funding for your school or something like that. Like all these things matter. And I think that if there's anything that we have learned is our takeaways from the last 3 years, especially, is that we do have more power. It's based upon proximity. I think the Catholics call it subsidiarity, but I think that that's something that we should be focusing on as well. And the online is a great tool to help us organize and to meet with people IRL, so to speak. But I just think that it gets really, really concerning when I see more people that just don't know what's going on in their backyard and are more happy to see what the latest trends are when an explosion goes off in certain countries.
Hmm. There's a lot of argument on like right wing Twitter lately about um, like regional culture. So in the United States, I think that culture has like the general American culture has expanded, and most people now are lacking some form of uh, extremely identifiable local or regional culture. Um, you and I both live in Texas, where it's more that is more. I guess it's stronger. That is, it's more identifiable things that are part of Texan culture. Whereas if you live in Nebraska, unless you live in a rural town where you are like where people are farmers or something, or whether maybe you live in Iowa or a suburban town in Virginia, maybe those places look more similar than they have in the past. Maybe they even look more like somewhere in Oregon or California, a comparable place. And so, a big argument and discussion that's happening right now is whether or not people from one state, for example, like a conservative or at least a Republican from California, should be able to move to a rural town in Idaho or in Texas, or someone from New York should be able to move to Virginia. And the debate is basically if they are as disruptive to the local culture and the local way of life as someone from a foreign country. And then, like, if that should be, if those local regional cultures should be held on to, or if we should accept something new. What do you think? Do you think that um, I guess I'm just asking what your take on that is. Do you think that we should be trying, like when we're living in our communities, like you're talking about, rather than online or wherever else, when we're living in our communities, should we be trying to revive the culture that's been local there, or should we accept that some things have passed and just try to make do with what we have? Maybe it's a blend of those two. I don't know.
I think it's a blend. I mean, I think that no one would seriously say that things have stayed the same 100% of the places that we want to like call these like based or local or small town refuge. I mean, right now there are places like where I live, like where the biggest sort of like cultural battle is about whether or not they really want to support the building of like a Dollar General.
Mm.
I mean, for the spats that we've seen on Twitter, I think that there's a lot of legitimacy to the fact that there's so much like rent seeking behavior for like, oh, there's going to be a new development, we're going to have like our strip malls and our Walmarts, there's going to be a really cute nail salon on the corner. Like there is that sort of like, they tore down heaven, built, put up a parking lot kind of deal situation. Now that doesn't necessarily mean, abandon all hope that ye who enter in here, because if there's one thing that I have learned from those that do embrace things locally is that you can't that the local aspects do have a treasure trove of knowledge. A good friend of mine by the name of Paul Fahrenheit, he lives in like one of those small Virginia towns, and he's just driving, and he was just picking up, histories of like the county and like pamphlets or books that he would drive through, and he got a better understanding of the region and the culture. But I mean, yeah, things have definitely changed. That doesn't mean that we should just forego and not try and preserve things that have mattered. I say this as someone that has like protested to, keep up monuments um along those lines. It's just that it gets so easy, like that whole thing that we've kind of been seeing on Twitter. I think that we're kind of alluding to, I think, some of the Scott Greer stuff that has been said.
Mm-hmm.
To which I think Scott is right to a significant degree that like there's a lot of places that are small town that where their identity is just like there's the whole thing about like the Midwest where I had dated someone for a significant period of time who was from there, and like their thing is like, oh yeah, like we would go to Walmart at like 11 o'clock at night because we had nothing better to do. And it just, to me, that seems like maybe a continuation of like that 1980s mall rat kind of attitude, but at the same time it's just like, is there anything else that's going on other than for us to wander aimlessly through like the aisles of Walmart at 11 o'clock at night? um it's a tough question, but at the same time, this is why I also think that the reason why we're also having this conversation is because we are so detached and deracinated from the sort of normative, historical culture that's rooted there. Like, I doubt that many people can talk about the history of their small towns or talk about where they're from with any ad length, extemporaneous or impromptu. Like, can you talk about this for an hour type deal? I mean, I think that it's important for us to recognize what we've lost and then be saying, okay, like this is what we're disconnected from. How do I get back, to understanding the culture, the nature, or how do I even just stop it from getting worse? Because a lot of the things that I've noticed, especially for us, right, because we both live in Texas, we both live in that sort of red state, Texas conservative attitude, is that we're kind of being aware that at the governor's mansion, Governor Abbott will cheer on and on that like Republican pro-business policies are bringing all this business and growth to the economy to Texas, while he's simultaneously importing all of those workers from Silicon Valley and other places that are going to vote him out in a couple of election cycles. It's just it's a difficult question, and I'm glad that we're kind of starting to have the conversation, because to me, I just want people to get off their phones for 5 minutes, break bread with their neighbor, and understand what the heck is going on at the county commissioner's court downtown. But I don't think a lot of people really do that. I mean, and the way that that is just that people are so politically illiterate. Our news cycles, our big, personalities that we follow, there's always this focus on the international. There's always this focus on what's happening on Capitol Hill, but not enough people that are paying attention to the state legislature. They're not reading their local newspaper or news affiliate about what the county commissioners just did at the last meeting. I want us to move in that direction, because while the national is important, Lord knows that the federal government can come up with a million ways in the next 10 minutes to screw you and I over. It doesn't mean that we're also not going to be affected by what, county commissioner court's going to do, what the mayor said, et cetera. I think that we do need to have a much healthier balance.
Right, I agree. And so what got me more focused on the local side of things, because so you mentioned Greg Abbott. I was part of a campaign to primary Greg Abbott in the last season. I was working with the Don Huffines campaign trying to get...
I voted for him.
he's it's a real shame that he didn't make it in, which could be a whole video of its own. But great guy, really good guy, true believer. But so I was doing that, and so I'm glad that people are focusing on it, because in 2020 I was, of course, doing everything I could to try and get Trump reelected. I was, even once things were going in the direction that we saw them turn on with election day and everything, I was out at the Stop the Steal stuff, and all the pressure was on state legislatures to certify or not certify the votes. And so these people actually do have a great amount of power. But beyond that, beyond the power that they have over the national stuff, you do see, whenever you look closely, that these people are the ones that have most power to affect the lives of people in your area. And so I became much more interested with that, and not even to mention that with whatever happened with the 2020 election, not something that's that's welcome to be discussed on YouTube, but with whatever happened there, it's much less, you have much less, there's much less oversight, there's much less guarantee that any efforts that you put in will actually yield anything. And so my focus has shifted much more to state and local level politics. And so I do want to ask, one thing that you mentioned was like your friend driving through Virginia and stopping, and I would guess stopping at like historical sites and picking up pamphlets and looking at the history of areas of this area. And that, of course, was much more common now. Like the history of our country, like the people, the American people, the history of like the region and everything is much less important. Most people have little to no idea about where they came from, even their own family. Most people probably can't even name their great grandparents these days, let alone the great figures of their grandparents' day, like in the local area or otherwise. And but one thing that runs throughout there was like a common thread that runs throughout these local cultures, whether you live in Virginia or Indiana or Texas or California. There was something that united us all. It was a common heritage and a common history. We could trace ourselves back to the Civil War. We could find common cause like in the reconciliation between North and South. We could go back to the Revolution and look at what happened there, even if it wasn't something like, oh, this was my family, my people. It could just be this common history that we share, these common principles that the country was founded on. You look at old celebrations of 4th of July or other patriotic events, and there's something that really unites people there, just with like a common affection for the history of the United States and the national character that we all shared or believed that we shared. And so this, I think, does matter even at the local level. There has to be something, I think, to unite us as a nation. There has to be something to revive that common mutual affection that we all had for one another. And of course, like within the United States, there are multiple nations at this point. There's multiple competing nations and interest groups. But to really unite America and any allies which may be in this country that want to be a part of the country, where do we find those common things? Like, how do we decide what from our past we can choose? Because like you said about like local stuff, local traditions, there are some things about our national character and our history that are just never coming back. But do you have, like, in your opinion, do you have anything that you think is something that we should be rallying around, that we as people with some kind of online influence, like right-wing anons, thinkers, and then people obviously in higher, more public positions, is there something that we should be highlighting and trying to get the country to rally around?
I guess that really is the $1 million question. Sort of, well, used to be the $64,000 question, but we can thank inflation for that. But it's just it's hard because I mean that's another thing about being so uprooted is that we want to strive for this American ideal, strive for this country that we have this belief in that we want to adhere to. And then at the same time, it's just like, well, that belief that we were raised as younger, as children and we were socialized to, like that's gone, like that's not something that's going to readily come back or be available to, which is, it really sucks, right? Like I'm going on 27, like, like I grew up during the Bush years. Like I saw this, raw American patriotism really transform into what it is today. And we witnessed narrative shifts sort of around that great awakening 2012 period, 2013. And it's just like, well, what did we have before? And you have these historical figures, these images, these narratives, and great men and great women, but we're also so innately disconnected, both through education, the media, and and again, this sort of goes back to the thing that's been said for decades now, that the country is an idea. um and okay, if the country is to be an idea, and not something else, which that can be a whole other stream for another time. But if you're gonna hold on to the narrative that America is an idea, like you need to have the right set of ideas, because right now we live in a situation where systematically, history, media, education, the public polity generated by Twitter and media conglomerates and etc., is fundamentally asking to reify the national idea into something that is the anathema of what it once was. And that's really the problem that we're dealing with. Whether it's, of course, about the sort of the civil rights regime that we live under. Richard Hanani has done great work about our life is basically a second constitution since 1965, or that we have no real connections because we've just really become more consumeristic than ever before. Like, it gets really concerning that I think more and more people these days are willing to identify with sports teams that aren't even really regional anymore, but that's what they go by. It's been very hard for people to say, "Oh, I identify as someone from Texas. I identify as a Virginian." Old concepts that are long gone. And I mean, how do we press forward? How do we create an idea? And I think that a lot of that does have to do by having these conversations. I mean, what is the American ideal? What is the American country? How do we get people on board with something where we can get along? And I mean, that's sort of been the challenge, is also to just like stop the bleeding. Like with what Cruz Rufo has been doing with CRT, and the fact that I think that the phrase anti-white has been said by more public politicians is a good sign. But getting an idea or to synthesize a new one, I right now I just do feel presently, and I'm still thinking this out. I may change my mind, or I may do a video on this in the future, but right now it's just that I have to be against what has been the systematic destruction of history, locality, and basically everything that I've witnessed in like the last 15 years. But to take a line from Murray Rothbard, I should also just go fully and repeal the 20th century while I'm at it. But that's my long-winded ramble there. I'm not sure if I got a definitive answer, and for that I apologize.
No, that's fine. I thought it was very good. And I mean, you're right. It is a big question. It's something that we probably not something that you really can just like develop an answer to. It's probably something that will, like, the answer will probably only emerge after trial and error of several different things, and after the situation that we're in develops further. Like, because these things are still happening. It's still even just the cultural alienation of the American people in their own country, as that's like still fairly recent. I mean, we're a young country, so it's been, in this past like 60, 70 years or whatever, but 60, 70 years in the big picture is not very long. So these things are still transpiring. Um, do you have any opinions on the role of the church in all of this and what we're talking about now?
Well, that's a loaded question. I guess it depends on which church we're talking about. Or are we just referring to like Christianity in
That's a good
general?
question. That's a good that's a good point to clarify. So,
I
um,
believe you're an Anglican, right?
I am an Anglican, so
Okay.
I would say Christianity, like broadly, just Christianity. But
Okay.
then also, even though we may disagree on this, I would like to hear like specifically what you think about what Christianity in America should look like in the future.
Well, that's a fun question to ask, right? Because I think for a lot of people, I had a stream not too long ago with a good friend of mine. He and I are both converts, or he's a full convert. I'm in the process of converting. We're both Orthodox Christians, which of course is not very an American thing historically, except for like John Liddell in like the South during the Confederacy period, or during the 1920s or the 1800s in Alaska. So, and the question one kind of to ask was like, well, how did you get here? One, I think that there's a reason why a lot of that happens is just because the American Christian tradition has been so utterly like I do think a lot of it lost to some degree in the wave of new atheism in the mid aughts to the early 2010s. And a lot of people just kind of have grown up, especially young Zoomers that I see that are joining the Catholic Church, or are coming back to Christianity in all forms, where it's just that they're looking for something that's rooted, that has survived. And if in most of the forms that people I think have come back to Christianity, it is rooted in something that has this tradition that we can trace back to 2,000 years with the birth of Christ, and even further through the Christology of the Old Testament. But I think that America will be a Christian country. I mean, more Americans than anywhere else in the West still have a fervent belief in God. We still have the largest, I think, population of church-going people in the West. Like, I could be wrong on that number, but I mean, we're gonna have all different kinds of denominations in here. I mean, there's a lot of new immigrants that have come to the country that are also Roman Catholic, and then the Pew Research Center has said that a lot of Latinos are becoming evangelical around the third generation or so, and drifting away from that. I mean, for better, whatever it's going to be, right? All of these denominations, like America, the church, Christianity has to play a role. It has been the foundational set of morals for the United States since its very beginning. Christianity has been used to sort of be the cultural vanguard against a lot of things from the outside threats. It's been an issue to fight back against. and it's taken this battering for the last, you know, really for the last 60 years. Because I mean, we got rid of prayer in schools at a period of time in the courts when, over 95% of the country was like devout Christian church going people. So it has taken a beating, but also the religious aspect of American culture is still the most potent political tool that America still has, at least for us who are traditionally, or at least right wing in minded people. I mean, the March for Life thing has still been the most religiously, organized and the most well funded and most effective, political tool I think that a lot of people still have. I think that when people look for tradition, the whole American idea was just, the whole courthouse and church house and the home. And it has to be a part of it in some form or fashion. And it has to, I think, starting first and foremost, it needs to root out the progressivism that has taken root in these churches. There should be no reason that we're having, priests and pastors and reverends accepting things and talking about things that are so antithetical to Christ's teaching and antithetical to just normal civil society, that it'll play a role. Whether our more secular or agnostic friends on the right would like it, that force is here to stay.
All right. And so what and again, this might be one of those big questions which doesn't necessarily have an answer. Um, so in democracy in America, one thing that de Tocqueville notes is the contrast in like the generations between Europe and America. That in Europe at the time it was generally that the way that you were born would determine the way that your life would be and the career that your profession and all of that. Whereas in America, you have the freedom. It does if you're born to a carpenter, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be a carpenter. If you're born to anybody in one profession, or if you're born in a certain social class, that it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be there for the rest of your life, or that your children will be there. That they'll be in the one that you were born into or worked your way into. And so while this is good, while this is, depending on your perspective, of course, while this is highly valued by Americans, it leads to a disconnection between people from one generation to another, and that it disconnects the tradition of the country. Like it severs a line in a certain respect. Of course, you can carry on traditions, but it becomes harder if you're not supposed. And then, of course, he gets into other stuff about how this makes it harder to develop like families who become experts and of all of that. But that's a little bit of a different topic. So with us being separated from that old tradition, that old way of doing things, for better or worse. Um, what like social structure changes? What social structural changes should we be working towards? And I like, for example, a lot of people like on Twitter, for example, this is generally like traditionalist Roman Catholics. I don't know your opinion on this. But like they'll react against what is seen in America, which is like that what I just described, and they'll say that we need to go back to something instead where we like abolish the nuclear family because it's evil, and we have to go into communal living where we're living but with our cousins and our three generations up and down and all of this. And so it's understandable given the situation that we're in here in America. But do you think that there are any of these things that we should be working towards, that we should be trying to change, or is this something that we'll just kind of have to wait and see what works?
Well, you need social, but you also need policy change. I mean, one thing that like American culture has been so fundamentally like affected by really is the rise of like the metropolis, the megacity. I mean, we know. I mean, what is the countless thing that we see every Thanksgiving period? There's always the news showing the stretch of California highways or New York highways that are just clogged with cars trying to get home. There millions upon millions of people every year leave small town, they leave suburbia, they leave where the family is rooted from, and they go to Los Angeles, they go to New York, they go to Chicago, wherever, what have you. I think that that's one huge cultural thing that is will continue to play a role. I mean, there's always, I mean, it's part of city and urban development of civilization, right? There's always more jobs in the city and things to do like that. My The thing, however, about having tradition or having some kind of way to support the home, I mean, like I used to live in a place. I used to live in El Paso, Texas, and I mean, people would leave that city in droves, especially the young, because there was nothing to offer them there unless they were well connected. I mean, that is a city where the city manager makes like 400 grand a year, but the median household income average for that city is like 20 something thousand a year. Like it's a
Hmm.
disastrous, disassociation between government and its people. And I get it, right? That doesn't even begin to address like cross-border issues. But like I think that they're always asking the question, like, why are people leaving? Why are people leaving? It's because you're not investing in the home. You're not creating anything. You're not leading the direction as statesmen or leaders in a direction that would get them going. So I mean, until we as individuals decide to sort of maybe embrace that old frontier spirit and say, like, this is where I will build and they will come, then that'll be an issue. But we also would have to radically change political in state incentives as well, like maybe tax cuts or whatever. Like, oh, you didn't change your address, and you started a business within the same place that you live. Like, oh, congratulations, we can give you some kind of incentive or tax credit or something. But I mean, there are some things that won't change. Like, I mean, the allure of the big city will always be there, but I do think that it would help that if we were to provide cultural and social and policy incentive to help people stay and be invested in their community, because we look at places where it's just like, wow, like the schools really suck, or oh, like all these things have happened. um until you sort of address those things and say, like, well, I live here, I should really care, then it'll be very hard for people to do that when they can go somewhere else, like 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, wherever away.
Right. Are you and this might be a little bit loaded. Are you optimistic and when I say pessimistic, I don't mean cynical, but are you optimistic or pessimistic about the trajectory that we're on?
Pessimistic. Pessimistic in the fact that I think a lot of people on Twitter get really excited where they'll post memes where it's just like, yeah, like I'm waiting for my Mad Max style dystopia or whatever. And it's not ever going to be like that. I mean, I think that you're sort of heading towards either the Californication of the rest of the country, or what really is South Africanization, where it's just like rolling blackouts. Water's going to be very, like they're already putting like water bans, like how much you can, garden in certain areas and things like that. I just think, and even here in Texas, right, we've already got notifications about our energy grid during the summer, and of course now with these last two winter storms. It's just something that I'm concerned about, because I don't know. I wonder how much people would complain if we just had competent people in charge, but that's sort of the reason why I'm pessimistic, is because we have this new patron system that's like almost anti-Jacksonian in the same way, where like we reward our friends, punish our enemies, but we reward our friends that just happen to be the world's most incompetent people, and they know that they're incompetent. Otherwise, they wouldn't have the press secretary going up there saying she's black, gay, and a woman of immigrant descent. Like thank you for giving me the reasons why you were hired, not because of why you're good at your job. We've regressed in a lot of ways into incompetency, and that should be very scary, for considering that this place used to be sort of like the cultural and political envy of the world.
Is there anything is there anything that we haven't covered that like one statement that you would like to say if you could communicate to somebody anything about this subject about deracination and reconnecting yourself, rerouting yourself? Is there anything that if you could get one thing across to people, do you have that? Do you have like one thing, like your one message?
Yeah. So a lot of people online will, in some form or fashion, tell you to go outside, touch grass, log off. And even you yourself have probably said that at one point in time to somebody, either as a way to just tell them to shut up, or maybe out of some genuine concern. You cannot point them towards outside. You cannot point them towards a playlist of Gregorian chants or a based anime or a based TV show and hope that they'll get better. It requires you to address these problems of deracination the same way that you would address an alcoholic with a problem. If you simply say, go get help, or you talk down to them in a condescending fashion, odds are you're probably not going to succeed in this. If you have any position of influence, if you're a creator, if you write, or even if you just have a group of friends that you're concerned about, you have to humanize yourself, but most importantly, you're also going to have to conduct some form of psychological triage to know who's way too online and those that are actually worth putting the effort in to save, because your time is just as valuable. It's difficult, especially when we do live so much of our political life online. But if all that you're going to be, right, is this e-right or this e-whatever that you want to call yourself, then you'll always exist in the ephemeral digital space and never the meat space, the IRL. If you have a group of friends or like people that you trust or people that you know or you've talked with for hours and hours, it would help to conduct that triage and maybe do some things in real life, even if that means getting a lunch or meeting up for a hobby or taking a class together. You are going to survive this, if especially if you're not alone. Which is why I think both, Jake and I are going to tell you to like go to church, like like your parish, your community, your congregation's a great place to have support and to have allies, because even if you consider them to be normie or boomers or whatever, they're far more likely to give you the life advice and the support expertise that you need, far more than some guy that has a frog profile picture, and I'm just as guilty of that. So that would be my message, is that this stuff does matter. This stuff is important. It's great to have the parasocial relationship, but like you and I especially, we should be using that to channel that energy into productive life, beneficial ways, so to speak.
Yes, I totally agree. That's one reason I many people may know, some may not. Like in the future, if you're watching this, I've like redirected my online presence, and it's largely for that reason. Like this stuff actually matters, and the internet is like certainly not the most important part of it. One thing I'd like to ask you to expand on just a little bit, because I think that it's so important. That's such a powerful and important message, the whole thing. But if you could expand on what you mean when you mention this idea of like the triage. I've heard you mention this in another video. I think
Yeah.
that's very important, and it's something that is pretty difficult for most people.
Sure. So it's kind of easy to tell, I think, when you're talking to people online, but also in the real world, if they're just a little too online. I gave a whole speech on this actually at a conference in February. I guess I'll take a snippet where it's just like, if you ever hear someone like use sort of the internet jargon in the real world, where it's just like if someone says based or Lindy or whatever, like you can kind of tell already, like the signals out that you kind of know that that person's online. Which, don't get me wrong, it's kind of cool. It's like right wing Polari, but at the same time, you gotta have a better understanding of how to talk to people. It's like you can't talk about that in front of the girls, bro. But at the same time, it's just like if their entire worldview, like if they act like the stereotypical doomer, if they think that all hope is lost, that women aren't worth talking to, or if women are worth talking to, it's because of like certain, like if they've got the porn brain on, if they've got the sort of idea that their entire worldview, their entire a priori schema of how they observe the world is based off their takes on the internet, or they've downloaded their personality, like people like to meme about with Ryan Gosling films. Like you do have to kind of understand, maybe can I get this person to like, what is your real life like, what do you do for a living, and things like that, because it matters. Like I've had people ask me, I'll get a DM since I've been talking about this, and they're like, hey man, like I work at a warehouse, I would like to get better public speaking skills, like how do I do these things? And it's just like, well, I have a public speaking background, it's part of what I do for like my normie 9 to 5 job. Let's talk about it. Like most of the time they'll come to you and they'll ask for help, but if you're like really concerned about somebody or someone that you call a friend, then you have to take steps to kind of see where are they coming from, what's the life like, what's the home situation. But it also requires you to humanize yourself. I got really inspired by my friend Lambda. He goes by Luke. His name's Luke. He does Lambda Bible studies. He's a great guy, but he started showing his face and using his name to let people know that he's very serious about what he believes in and what he
Mm.
does. And that was sort of the thing that I started doing. Is just like, it's nice to have the content and all the stuff that I do, but I genuinely believe that if we're going to do anything, you do have to be human about it. And so that's what I said this yesterday on another stream. I said the super chats and the subscribe star bucks are nice, but at the end of the day, the most like profitable spiritual thing I've ever been told is when people message me saying like, hey man, thank you, or like what you're doing is worth it, and like I listen. that matters more. And again, that's where like parasocial part comes in. But at the same time, that triage thing matters because some people will willingly choose to stay and escape on the phone, and others are more interested about wanting to accomplish the goals that we all do, like life, family, marriage, kids, success. And sometimes people need friends. And when so many of us over the last 2 years have gotten to be exclusively online, we should be in a position now, especially as Americans, because things are a little much more relaxed than they were overseas, to take that kind of action and help bring people out of the digital space and into the real space.
Yeah, it's tough, especially, I mean, because I have some friends in real life who are not like online at all, really. I mean, they have like they'll scroll through like Instagram Reels, so they're not even like on TikTok. They're just like see Reels on Instagram every once in a while. Like that's the extent of their online activity. And many of them agree with me, but they still just like I don't even maybe they're just not aware of it, but then others who are aware, and I have one friend in particular who is like very passionate about things happening in the church and believes things very similar to what I believe about politics. But anytime it comes up, it's like he's like, "Oh no, I just don't think it's. Um, I don't think there's anything I can do. I don't really want to get involved. That's not my thing or whatever." And so it's tough to talk to people and try to bring them out or try to show them that there is like something more real and something more fulfilling, while also understanding that some people just will refuse to come along, in that come along and see what at least even see what you're trying to talk about. So.
Well, I've learned that a lot of people are like I mentioned earlier, a lot of them are like politically illiterate, and people love to complain, right? People love
Mm.
to doom scroll or just be like, I don't really care, I just don't think it's worth it. Because 90% of the time they don't know that most of their problems have a phone number and an address that's like 10 minutes from like where they live or where you're
Mm.
talking to them at. And I think that channeling their anger or their complaints into here's the name and the phone number in the office downtown that you need to talk to, like that usually helps a lot.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Very true. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I've really enjoyed this discussion. Um,
Thank you.
I look forward to any future conversations we may have in the future. Would you like to tell people again where they might find your work?
Sure, you can find me as the Prudentialist on YouTube, Telegram, Odyssey, Gab, Twitter, just about everywhere. Findmyfriends.net/the Prudentialist. If you're interested in what I do, I talk about culture and I go fishing every now and then on my channel. But every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern, I provide a lecture stream on international relations and geopolitics. So if you want to know a little more about how the world works from sort of breaking down these complex topics and making it digestible for you, then that's where you can find me every Sunday, 4 p.m. Eastern live.
Right. I highly recommend it. If you enjoy my content, I feel like some of the spirit of what we talk about is a little bit similar, but I would say with a little bit more knowledgeable on the Prudentialist channel. So definitely recommend that everybody go check it out. Thank you so much for coming on. I hope you have a
Well,
great
thank you.
rest of your afternoon.
Appreciate it.
All right, folks. Well, thank you for tuning in. I hope that you enjoyed that. I hope that you found it as edifying as it was for me. It's been a great, I really enjoyed it, to say the least. I've said that a couple times now, but I really did. Very edifying information, and I hope that it was the same for everybody else watching. Right. Well, I'll see briefly what the live chat is saying. If there's sometimes there's interesting comments in the live chat, sometimes there are not so interesting comments. So I'll see what y'all are saying real quick and maybe interact with you for a few minutes, and then I'll go ahead and hop off here. I will be back on Monday. Let's see. Sorry, I got to click back through YouTube and everything. I need to streamline my stream setup here online. So see some familiar faces in chat. Good to see everybody here. All right. Well, looks like I have to scroll back and stuff to see the chat. So anyway, thank y'all very much for tuning in. I had a great time. I hope to see you back on Monday. And I'm hoping that the following week we'll get I'll change the video schedule, the stream schedule, but the video The video content that I promised will be coming out soon, and that's why I'll be doing less streams here in the future. I'll be working on the video content, and I'm very excited about that. I'm very excited about the stuff that I'll be talking about in the future. It'll be more serious, and I think that the stream schedule will be more manageable for me. It's hard, and you get burnt out when you try to talk about try to come up with a new serious topic every day to discuss. It becomes very difficult, and it's easy to get burnt out. It makes me not want to do it as much. So I think if we do this a couple times a week, maybe once a week sometimes, we work on the videos and stuff, then we'll be in much better shape there. So thank you all for watching. I hope that it was good for you. I will see you next week. For now, have a great rest of your evening and a great weekend. God bless.